Hey, Typology family, welcome back to the podcast on which we explore the mystery of the human personality and the privilege of what it means to be a human being through the lens of the Enneagram. As always, I'm joined by my friend Anthony Skinner, and today also by our new friend Enneagram Two with a three-wing, Thais Gibson. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm grateful to be here with you today.
All right. Man, you've got quite a resume. People have heard it at the beginning of the show, which is fabulous, but we want to get to know you deeply. So tell us about your journey as an Enneagram 2 and how it has affected your self-understanding.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I think from a very young age, a lot of my conditioning had a lot to do with being the helper, the supporter. I think I grew up in a household or family where they had a lot of chaos. My parents, they were very loving, very good hearted people. They just had a lot of their own unresolved things that they tended to bring into the relationship together. And I was the eldest of two kids. I think I got a lot of my needs met to feel connected when I was jumping in the middle and supporting and hearing each of their side and trying to help them from a very young age to dissolve arguments and work through things. And I think that very much shaped me as getting positive associations connected into being the helper, the giver, the supporter, like that person who was in there. And when I would do that, it would be positively reinforced. I would get love, or I would get a pat on the head, or I would get that attention or presence from two people who were often wrapped up in their own challenges, too much to be as available and present consistently as I probably would have needed as a child. And so I think that that was my strategy. A big part of my personality had this subconscious strategy built in without me, of course, recognizing it consciously at the time to learn to connect through helping and giving. And of course, if that was then positively reinforced, that became a big foundational piece of my conditioning. Now, on the downside, I also became very enmeshed at a young age. I became very codependent. I had a lot of codependent relationships. I had to really work through a lot of those things later on. But definitely, I think that was a big part of what shaped the foundation.
The other day, someone just defined codependency to me as lighting yourself on fire to warm other people.
Ooh.
I know. I kind of,
Really like that, but that totally lines up to my flavor of codependency when I was younger, for sure.
and of course, twos and nines are really more. Any type can be codependent, right? But twos and nines, I think, have a particular vulnerability in that direction. And I guess my question to you is now, as an adult who's done quite a bit of work, like, how do you work against the message that you can't be okay unless everybody else is okay?
Okay, so this is a really big part of my journey, honestly, and in my healing. And it actually, there were many things that kind of changed it, learning that I'm not responsible for people's pain, learning to set boundaries, practicing reconditioning my relationship to boundaries over time. I mean, a lot of those things played a role. But I think the fundamental thing that changed this for me deeply is that through sort of a spiritual teaching I came across, I sat down one day and the teaching was talking about how pain is such an important part of growth. Like we tend to see pain as being one-sided, only bad, only negative. And I decided as an exercise, I was going to sit down and look at some of the most painful times in my own life and ask, okay, what did pain teach me? And I sat down and I looked at I wrote down the top 5 things that I felt like were really painful. And I said, okay, how did I grow? What did I learn? What did I let go of that was no longer serving me? And I really sat with these things and I explored them. Like I sat in those for a moment. And by the time I was at like the end of the first one, I realized so profoundly and personally, like just very viscerally, like if I hadn't gone through this experience, I wouldn't have evolved to this next level of who I became. I wouldn't have become independent. Some of the things I was looking at is I had such a victim mentality when I was really young.
Yes.
And when I really took ownership and realized, hey, nobody's coming to bail me out. I better like take accountability and responsibility for my own life. That was one of the most freeing, life-changing things that ever happened to me. And so I was able to really look into some of these painful moments and go, oh my gosh, these served me profoundly. And I think when I stopped being so afraid of my own pain and stopped seeing pain as
Hmm.
one sided and seeing, wait, there's actually these hidden blessings to pain, hidden benefits, if we are willing to take the lessons from it, if we are willing to rise to the occasion,
Mm.
then in turn, I realized that me trying to go around my whole life and stop everybody from feeling pain was actually self serving. It was that I'm not okay if
Hmm.
you're not okay. So I'm actually trying to fix you to soothe myself. And instead, what I need to be able to do is sit here and go, hey, you're in pain and I'm going to respect you enough to know that you can grow and that you'll move through this. And maybe there's lessons or teachings in this for you. And I can be, a cheerleader from the side, or if you ask me for a specific need, I'll show up for it. But I'm no longer going to try to take sole responsibility because I'm actually robbing you of maybe some of the most fundamental and important lessons on your own journey. And when that clicked for me, that really allowed me to be able to sit with people in pain a little bit differently.
I love
Love
that.
that.
And it's very much a descriptor of, I think, what the Enneagram 2 has to, one of the tasks, right? Part of the Enneagram 2 project is to move from caring for people to caring about people,
Yes.
right?
Yes. That's
That's
beautiful.
what you're describing. I moved from caring for people, which is actually a very prideful stance because it assumes that you know what other people know better than they do, or what they need better than they do.
Mhm.
It's a prideful stance in that it assumes that you are less needy than they are, right? It's like it's just layered with some problems, and then just realizing that caring about someone is respecting their journey without necessarily shielding them from what is the necessary wound or pain that they have to pass through in
Mm.
order to get to the better version of themselves.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you. And I really do think, like you said, there's that prideful part. And that prideful part of going, oh, I'm fine, but you're not okay. So like I need to do it for you. I need to be here for you. And realizing that that's putting yourself above somebody else in a very
Mm.
sort of not arrogant way. It's not intentional. And it wasn't coming, my relationship to it wasn't coming necessarily from arrogance, but it is. There's this hidden pridefulness in that. And I absolutely agree. And so that was the first like big shift. I think there was other things, I think another part is that I really struggled growing up to trust. And I think that was because of the environment I was in. I saw a lot of broken promises or changes or people who said that this would be one way and things change. And I think I had this very fractured foundation of trust. And something else that really hit home for me was realizing that because that was my conditioning, I had really internalized that. So I had seen so much broken trust that I was constantly in my own people pleasing, betraying my own trust. Like saying yes when it was a no was a form of self betrayal. Trying to go and give of myself instead of give from a place of abundance and give what I actually had in terms of emotional or physical resources. And I realized as well that like part of my healing here isn't going to be constantly in this place of self sacrificing and kind of like martyrdom. It's going to be learning to receive from other people too, and to reach out and ask for help and to have good boundaries and tell my truth. Don't just say yes from a place of compulsive people pleasing and fear. Actually learn to, state my true yeses and nos from a place of self consideration. And when I learned to really consider myself and honor my boundaries, that also deeply repaired my relationship to self trust. And in turn,
Mm.
interestingly enough, it actually helped me build roots of trust with other people, because when you share your truth with people, they can consider you better. And when people consider you, it's a cornerstone of building trust. So I think that was another foundational piece of
Mm.
coming out of the codependency was also, hey, it's not just me unilaterally caretaking for people. There has to be a two-way reciprocal street in relationships, and that's when they're ultimately fulfilling.
Mm.
So you and I share a common journey, and that is a recovery journey. I'm a recovering, prescription medication addict, and as well as alcoholic. You have spoken openly about your opioid addiction, and I'm just curious to know: do you see an intersection between your journey of recovery and your Enneagram type? In other words, is there a relation? Was there a relationship between being Enneagram 2 and what it was you were trying to soothe using substances? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. I love your questions. They're very deep and thoughtful, and that's my favorite. So, in many ways, yes. So I think that a big part of what I was running from, and when I look at some of my childhood experiences and what that laid the foundation, I'll tell you a story, I guess, to best represent this. I remember being, in this early attempt to be in recovery originally, and I tried a lot of things first. I did inpatient and outpatient rehab programs and different things, and nothing was working for me. And really, I wasn't trying to work any programs myself in those early days. And eventually I was committed. Eventually I was like, I am sick and tired of suffering. Like I had suffered, I had been for sure at rock bottom and beyond. And I was like, okay, I got to figure this out somehow. And so I got committed, I think was the first step. But I remember in an early stage of this, I had a mentor who said, oh, you have to sit and meditate. And meditation will really help you. And it's helped me in my journey of recovery. And so I remember sitting down one day and the way that this meditation discussion was positioned was that meditation will help you realize your inner thoughts and some of your own internal dialogue, and it'll be really important for you. And your goal is to just observe your thoughts when you sit there. So I remember sitting down, and I was young, like I was like 20 years old, and I sat down. And nobody I knew was meditating at the time. It wasn't, as mainstream of a thing as it is all this time later today. And I remember sitting down and just being like, okay, observe your thoughts. And I sat down, and my first thoughts that I had, and I had never really observed my thoughts like this before, were, this is stupid. You're stupid. You're never going to be able to do this. You're never going to get sober. You're going to sabotage everything anyways. Why are you even bothering? And I remember, because it was this first moment of observing my thoughts, going, oh my gosh, no wonder I numb myself all day. This is what I'm numbing. And having this like extreme aha moment of going, oh my gosh, if somebody followed me around all day and talked to me like this, I would numb them out too. And realizing that so much of, unfortunately, my internal dialogue was also internalized dialogue that I grew up around. And that had been something I had internalized. It was my own conditioning through repetition and emotion, which is firing and wiring those neural pathways to begin with. And now I had become this to myself. And, within that were also a lot of these foundational patterns, right? Within that, it's like, okay, so now I'm numbing myself, I'm escaping myself, I'm hard on myself. But on top of that, I was not good at receiving, very two, right? Not good at reaching out for help, not good at like letting people in really in a vulnerable way. So they might have seemed vulnerable on a more superficial level, but not really. And this idea that on top of it, when I already had no resources to pull from myself, here I am still out there trying to do for everybody else from this complete place of lack. And it was this recognition that like, I have to get right within myself in these really deep ways. I have to learn to have boundaries. I have to learn to change my inner dialogue and how I speak to myself. I have to learn to actually know what my own needs are and how to meet them. Yeah. Yeah. And in doing that, that is going to help me on my way. And so in that process, I think that kind of opened me up to a big journey of self-discovery. And those are big points I focused on: my needs, my boundaries, the way I spoke to myself. And of course, there are some strong parallels there with what it means to be a 2 on the Enneagram. And I think without that, and without that sense of self-understanding and even sense of self in general, almost, it just made me so much more likely to need to run from this emptiness inside that I was carrying.
This is so great. And I love recovery stories. I hear them often in my work. And I have such a heart for that population, for us, not that population, us. And I always laugh. I say, I was imagining you just here sitting in group therapy and treatment, trying to help everybody else. Am I right?
Yes, totally. Oh my gosh. And like I would have, and it's so funny because I would always have people come to me and talk to me. And I had, open up to me. People my whole life always opened up to me super easily. I think because I'm very present. And I think that that's something that people must on some level be psychologically drawn to. And, and then as soon as people would tell me things, I would feel like, oh, that was sacred what they told me. I better fix it or solve it or be there for them in a place and time in my life where I had no idea what it meant to be there for myself. And so you can see that cycle just perpetuating itself. And for sure that played a role. Absolutely.
And it's interesting too that one of the things that when I've worked with Enneagram Twos, I'm like, okay, so you have to do your work and you have to do it in solitude.
Oh,
So
God.
Now, some types I might be inclined to say, actually, you need to do it in community, right?
Yep.
But for twos, it's really important for them to get alone with themselves in a place where they're not going to be tempted to fix other people reflexively, but where all they can sit with is, in the beginning, the frustration of not knowing their own needs.
Mhm.
They're so attuned to everyone else's needs
Mhm.
that you ask them what they need, and they're like, they start crying usually, right? I don't know what I need. Then, once they can get quiet enough and reflective enough and create a space for their own needs to actually announce themselves to them, then the two starts to kind of wake up and no longer disavow their own needs, but to welcome them,
Mm.
right? Not
Yeah.
to the exclusion of other people's needs, but in balance, right? And with good boundaries, because as you know, twos never heard the word no and enjoy it. And this is like so good because what you're describing is part of the healing journey for twos that you went on. So
So, may I share something else about that just
please, I'd love to
briefly?
hear it.
So I knew, and this is actually before I knew anything about the Enneagram, but I spent about 4 years deciding, and this sounds a little outrageous and maybe a little extreme. Maybe, I'm not recommending everybody do this, but I knew when I was on my sobriety journey, I was like, I need to learn how to be alone. And I took 4 years.
Mm,
And for 4 years, I did not go on a date. I did not exchange a text message with somebody I thought I would be romantically interested in. Because I just knew I was always drawn to like the wounded bird in relationships and caretaking
yes.
people. And I knew, I needed room. And I spent 4 years in a lot of solitude. And it was one of the most sacred and beautiful times of my life. And I actually do believe that if I hadn't done that, that I wouldn't have had the foundation to then learn to actually know my needs so deeply and so intimately that then
Right.
I could express them well in a relationship. I could
Yep.
Mhm.
know them in real time while in the company of other people. I was okay to have boundaries. So I just love that you said that because that really deeply resonated.
Well, and I think this is the genius of recovery communities, right? Like there is an oral tradition within recovery communities, which is don't date at the very least in your whole first year of sobriety, right?
Yeah.
I don't think 4 years is extreme. I mean, if that's what it takes to develop a relationship with yourself, so that you are capable of having a relationship with someone else,
Mhm.
Mhm.
right? If that's what it takes, that's what it takes. And I
Yeah.
think for a lot of people, 4 years would be just about the right amount of time to
Yeah.
go to school to understand yourself, right? Also, I think I've never met an addict that's not a codependent. Actually, I'm not sure that I have ever met anyone who isn't a codependent. I'm just saying, for sure, people in recovery need to work through issues of codependence, and that's particularly true for twos and nines.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So let's talk attachment theory. This is what you're known for, right? You've built this great platform, like helping others, heal attachment wounds. I could go through a summary of what attachment theory is. Can you do it in like literally 8 sentences? Like just tell because we've actually had a couple of attachment theory folks on the show before. So some people listening will either have been in therapy that where their practitioner is using attachment theory
Yeah.
work, or they've heard something about it. Give us your summary of it.
My summary would be that your attachment style is a subconscious set of rules that you've learned about love. So I'm a big believer in the idea of conditioning. I think we are all being conditioned all the time. We know there's such a thing as neuroplasticity, and whatever we're exposed to through repetition and emotion is firing and wiring neural pathways. And so, of course, that's especially prevalent in your childhood. So when you enter into childhood and relationship, what's modeled to you in terms of how people communicate needs, boundaries, work around conflict, share in general, how we give and receive love, all of these things are deeply ingrained in you, and the way that these things take place create your attachment style. So there are 4 major attachment styles, and again, it's the subconscious set of rules that you have about love. And I always think of like, if you have a different attachment style than somebody else, it's almost like sitting down to play a board game and you have a different set of rules. So like if you have the rules for Monopoly and I have the rules for Scrabble, and we're going to sit down and play a board game and try to have fun, even if we intend well and we want to have a good time, because we have a different set of rules, there's just going to be
Yes.
unnecessary friction and chaos. And that's why I think our attachment style is such an important element to it. But a big part of what the work is that I focus on is not just what is your attachment style, it's how do you actually change it? How do we recondition what's maladaptive and not
Mm.
serve?
So everyone has different terms for them, depending on the school of attachment theory that you emerge from, right? So we have an anxious attachment style. We
Yes.
have the avoidant. Sometimes people call it avoidant dismissive, right?
Yep.
Then we have fearful, sometimes called fearful avoidant, right?
Exactly. Yep.
And then the last one, that's disorganized, right? So
No, you're
fear,
fearful and disorganized are the same. Exactly. And then
right?
there's secure.
Secure, right? Now,
Yeah.
here's what's interesting. I mentioned this on a show the other day. I, as a young man, prior to sobriety on the first round, I would have described myself as a very unhealthy four, artist, creative, deeply wounded, with a avoidant personality style. That's how I would describe myself. It's interesting. I was very personable, but not very personal. So in other words, that was part of the avoidance, right? Like I don't want to get too personal. I can be personable, friendly, gregarious, all that stuff, but I am not getting too close here, right? Now, as I've gotten older, done decades of work, I took recently I took 4 or 5 attachment theory assessments, and I think they were pretty good assessments, like not quizzes in Vogue magazine, right? And and I come around consistently as secure now.
Yeah.
Now you were just mentioning about relationships. My wife, for sure, has a secure attachment style, for sure. And in the particularly last few years of her life, I feel like that's when a real shift. It took a long time for me to get to secure. But I grew up with a drug addicted father, an alcoholic father who died from his disease. It was complete, utter chaos in my planet. So you can imagine we're going to have some attachment issues here, right? Uh,
Absolutely.
and a mom who was well intentioned, but also insanely distracted by her husband and and very unavailable. So, you know, I do see that in my own relationship that over time, when the two of us finally kind of arrived at the same, when I arrived to where she was,
Yeah.
this beautiful thing emerged where one day I woke up and I was like, I have such a peaceful, beautiful relationship with this person. Um, can you tell me more about what I'm experiencing?
Yes, absolutely. I think that one of the biggest things is when you do a lot of work and you're consistent and you show up and eventually it reconditions your attachment style indirectly. Um, that there's two parts to this. One part is that eventually your nervous system learns to regulate. And, something that's really interesting is your conscious mind is responsible for roughly 3 to 5% of all of your beliefs, thoughts, emotions, actions. Your subconscious is 95 to 97%. And so ultimately, our subconscious drives our behavior and it's what makes our decisions for us. And what's so interesting about what you just shared is how frequently, when we grow up in chaos, our nervous system keeps seeking it out. Too much, peace or
Yes.
calm can feel
Yeah.
boring or even, disruptive. Like we're waiting for the other shoe to drop all the time.
Yes.
And once you become securely attached, one of the actual fundamental pillars to becoming secure is that your nervous system has learned to actually rest, to spend
Mm.
more time in parasympathetic. And then we derive a sense of peace from securely attached relationships instead of feeling like, wait, this is boring or this is confusing or when's all the chaos going to ensue and we're waiting and on edge. And so I think probably one of the first sort of sort of signs that you saw happening is that your nervous system regulated and all of a sudden peace was peaceful, which is actually really beautiful. And the second thing is that actually a little bit outside of or just the topic of attachment styles, there are 6 stages to every relationship. So we have the dating stage, 0 to 6 months. After that, we go into the honeymoon stage when we make a commitment that usually lasts about a year and a half after. Then we have the power struggle stage, which is where most people break up in relationships. But also, we can be in the sustained power struggle stage for like decades. We can spend a whole rest of our relationship in there. And if we make it out of that stage, we move into the stability, commitment, and then bliss stage. And often when we're in the bliss stage, there's also this deep sense of peace and well-being and deep fulfillment, I would call it, in being in a securely attached relationship. And literally one of the rites of passage to get to the bliss stage is that you almost certainly have to be secure. And so you have to be doing this underlying secure work, right? You have to be able to communicate needs, talk about boundaries, show up for each other, make healthy compromises, work through conflict in healthy ways. Like there's all these sort of prerequisites to arriving there. And so my imagination says that you probably have done so much work on things that were indirectly related to attachment styles over the years that you started to recondition your relationship to your needs, to your boundaries, to how you manage conflict, to vulnerability and what it meant to be open and share things. You probably regulated your nervous system over time as a result. And then eventually that allows you to move into the bliss stage of relationship. And all of a sudden you wake up going, oh my gosh, relationships are not like they were in childhood. And now I'm actually deriving this beautiful sense of peace from my relationship instead, which is a really cool thing.
Yes, I also think it was a fruit of recovery, which did a lot for indirectly teaching me about self-regulation. You know, when we talk about attachment theory, right, we, as I understand it, please correct me, that we have basic needs as children for being soothed, for being seen, for being safe. If we have those in place, that leads to our capacity to have secure attachment, right? If
Yes.
To our caretaker, and then by extension to future partners, friends, right? To the world at large. And if we don't, if there's a real or perceived absence of soothing, safety, and
Be seen.
being seen, then we might form a relationship with a person, a behavior, or a substance, right, that serves as a proxy for a secure relationship, right? So this is why I tell people early in sobriety, right? I'm always like, you're going to grieve the loss of a relationship here. You're going to grieve the loss of what in your, kooky little mind, but understandably kooky, came to believe would be the source of your first stable relationship, right? But then of course the substance became a bigger problem than the problem it was trying to solve, right?
Yes.
Which was your broken heart.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this is so beautiful that you said that because I'm such a believer, and I'm sure you've heard this a million times over, but the problem isn't the problem, right? Like
Exactly.
the problem is what is pre-existing. And for me, I saw this so much. Like I was a fearful avoidant attachment style. So the hot and cold, anxious and avoidant. And when I didn't have soothing, I love the way you said that. When I didn't have proper, adequate soothing that was consistent, I learned to rely on substances. And what's so interesting, and I actually talk a lot about this, is how much every single behavior we do, so in regards to addiction, but just in general, is a subconscious strategy to try to get needs met and thus soothe. And you see this in a variety of forms. Like you can look at really interesting things. You look at, substances or alcohol being a very obvious one, of course, but you look at things like anger, right? Somebody yelling and expressing anger. Well, what is somebody doing? Consciously, we can evaluate with our logical, analytical mind and say, raising your voice isn't getting you anywhere. It's not healthy to raise your voice. And yet people have anger issues that they go to anger management for and they keep repeating. But if you look, well, what needs does yelling get met and thus soothed
Yeah.
for?
Yeah.
Well, you get seen and heard because you get big and loud. You often finally say things that you've been holding in. So it's an attempt to get understood. And we use anger as a subconscious strategy to set a boundary. So someone yells and all at once in one fell swoop, they get these 4 needs met. And I never saw or worked with a single person with anger issues that first didn't feel deeply unseen, unheard, misunderstood, and have boundary issues. And you see this in every single behavior that we have, but this is especially relevant, of course, to alcohol, substances, because if you're in a position like I was growing up, where I just had no idea what it meant to soothe or be soothed, it's like, wow, something that numbs you out. And particularly for me, I think numbed out a lot of that ferocious internal dialogue, and I could escape from myself that way. Wow, what a great need that was meeting. And it was regulating in a sense. And
Right.
so you see, wow, every single thing that we do, and it actually goes for any unhealthy habit, addiction or non-addiction, where if we look, there's a hidden benefit to it because we don't know another way to source that need in a healthier form.
This is so rich because, and I'm going to repeat something I've said often on this show, but it's almost a mission. So I don't mind getting on my soapbox and preaching again. But whenever I hear people say, "Oh, well, Ian has a drinking problem," right? Or back when I was in my cups, and I would say, now I realize, no, 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 hold on a second. Ian doesn't have a drinking problem. Ian has a drinking solution.
Oh, I like that.
It's not a
Very-
problem. He's
yeah.
got a solution. Now, it's a misguided solution.
Mhm.
And in some ways, in my first go round, I would say that I'm actually really glad I had drinking until I could find a way to, like, it kind of, you know, I just remember a therapist saying to me, "I'm so glad you found alcohol because I'm not sure you would have emotionally and psychologically survived had you not found a way to soothe yourself until such time as you got here and we can figure this out together for you to live a new way in the world."
I couldn't agree more. And to be perfectly honest, I'm actually of the frame of reference where I believe that we use these tools as strategies, and maybe they are temporarily preventing us from being suicidal, or going down a further, potentially even darker path. And I really believe we're doing the best we can with what we know at the
Yeah.
time and what's
Yeah.
available to us. And just like you said, that's some sort of temporary solution when we just don't know of a better one. And
Yeah.
so the work, and what I believe in with this is that the work becomes one of the fastest, most like pointed ways to really move through some of this. Is I think there's two, at least in my own self exploration, I found two fundamental pieces to what it means to understand my own addiction. And for me, the first step was exactly what we talked about, identifying the needs that were actually being met and realizing these are needs I don't feel like I have access to. So I better learn healthy strategies to soothe by meeting these needs.
Mm.
And so that was the first major step, right? And you can use like a really obvious example, like the one we just talked about with yelling. Well, instead of getting heard and seen and understood by yelling at somebody, why not practice being vulnerable to get seen and heard? Why not practice communicating better and knowing what you need so you can convey your messaging in a healthier way? And oh my gosh, then the need for yelling falls away because you're always feeling seen and heard, right? So it's like, how do we solve for the needs that we're seeking with the unhealthy solution? Step one. And then I'm such a big fan of the conditioning. We're all being conditioned all the time. And what happens is each of our first experiences in addiction, and the first time we usually use, right, the old term like chasing the dragon, there's so many deeply positive emotional associations we have with that substance, right? We feel
Yes.
the peace, or we feel the euphoria, or we feel the escapism, or the confidence from alcohol, or whatever it might be based on somebody's drug of choice. And what's happened is our subconscious mind has been wired with a skew of positive versus negative associations. In other words, we see alcohol, for example, as exclusively positive. We see the opioids as exclusively positive. They're not. And that can be all this time later after, potentially somebody's had multiple DUIs or arrests or spent jail time or hurt people or lost their, spouse and children. But what's happened is the programming is what drives the show. So there's actually a beautiful exercise, and I did this on my own journey a lot, is I really got clear on, number one, the needs that substances were meeting and how to get healthier strategies to meet those needs. But then I did something called cost benefit rewiring, and it's a reconditioning exercise where it takes about 21 days to sort of refresh your neural networks, your neural pathways, through a lot of repetition and emotion that's sustained. And I wrote out for every day for 21 days, what are the costs of using? And what are the benefits of coming up with healthier strategies? And what I was trying to do was rebalance those emotional associations. And when you do this in a relaxed state, when your brain's producing more alpha brain waves, you're actually permeating your own subconscious mind to rewire some of these stored associations. And I'm definitely not going to sit here and say those were the only things that got me sober. There was a lot more to it, including a relationship to God and so many things. But that was profoundly helpful because I started to realize those conscious evaluations of going, oh my gosh, this makes me an unavailable person. This makes me do things that I regret. I spent all my money. I don't know who I am. I'm lost. I'm, all these things. Instead of that just being something I consciously kind of knew in the periphery, it instead became something I subconsciously deeply felt viscerally, because it's really our subconscious driving those feelings and behaviors.
Yes.
And so
Yeah.
that became a very helpful approach.
Yeah, it's really something when you move from just having information to having a felt somatic experience of the truth. So
Yes.
in your, not just in your brain, but in your body, in your heart, in your behaviors, there is a shift, and it is perceptible. You can actually say, there's been a shift. I feel a shift, right? Now, you just actually mentioned something interesting, and it feathers well with a conversation I had recently in your mention about God, because it's not, if we have a maladaptive attachment style, right? If we have a, right, and therefore, and you say this in Learning to Love, right? Because you explore how attachment styles kind of shape every relationship. That's
Yeah.
what, right? Am I correct?
Mhm.
So, how do we form a secure attachment to God?
Oh my gosh, I love this conversation. Okay, so I believe this, and this is from personal belief. I think you'll probably feel in pretty good alignment with this. I believe that just like we talked about how every time we have the problem isn't the problem is the solution. I believe that every behavior we enact is actually a subconscious strategy to get closer to God. Because if you look at
Oh,
the six basic human needs, right? If you look at the six basic human needs, what do we want? We want like certainty, novelty, significance, growth, contribution, love, and connection. And
yeah,
those are our needs that when we don't have any relationship to God at all, we then try to find through parents, right? And healthy attachment. But if we don't get access to that, we feel very lost on the path of. But
right,
I believe that those six basic human needs are deeply fulfilled through a relationship to God. But by the inverse, right? Because think about it, we got contribution if we're being of service to God or a servant of God. We get love and connection in a profound way that's not going to be taken away. We get the novelty of learning and growing in relationship to God. I mean, it goes on, but you see that. But in the exact opposite, to go back to that original question, when we don't we don't grow up in relationship to God, that gets taken away through maybe our childhood environment conditioning, um, and then on top of that we get unhealthy conditioned patterns. Then we instead project our conditioning from our relationship to our parents onto the relationship with God. So, the wounds that we carry as an attachment style, I find very much interfere in the relationship to God. So, for example, you have an anxious attachment style, somebody who's fearing abandonment. Then what happens is they fear abandonment and they feel like God's going to leave them. Oh, God, or they fear being unloved. Oh, how do I know that God loves me? Is God even here for me? Why would God let me be in this situation to begin with? And we actually project our own conditioning of wounds from childhood onto God. I remember for myself, fearful avoidance have a big betrayal wound. And I felt very betrayed by God. I was like, okay, if God's real, why would I be having this kind of life? Like, why? And so exactly what we're missing in the beginning by not having that relationship to God deeply nurtured or conditioned into us, or allowing it to sustain, because I believe we're actually born with it. But by that being taken away, then the maladaptive conditioned patterns we then in turn project onto God, and it just becomes this sort of vicious cycle, if that makes sense. But by the other token, when we actually get into relationship to God, I also believe it has a huge impact in a positive way on the relationship we have to our attachment style, because now our needs are met in such a deeper way. And a lot of these wounds, we don't, when you're in true relationship to God, you don't believe God is going to leave or betray you any longer. You start to see things as like a lesson from God or God guiding you when you're walking in faith.
oh, I love that. It's so interesting. I'm a big fan of Carl Jung, and Jung had a friendship via correspondence with Bill W., the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. And in fact, Carl Jung is often credited as being the anonymous founder of Alcoholics Anonymous,
Oh, wow.
of which most people don't know that
I
story.
did not
But
know that.
there is a letter, one letter that's very famous between Bill W. and Carl Jung. And Carl Jung says something about a mutual friend of theirs that he once treated for alcoholism. And he says this. He says Roland's craving for alcohol was the equivalent on a low level of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness, expressed in medieval language as the union with God.
That's beautiful. That is like that lends very, very deeply, and I couldn't agree more. I really believe that is
Yes,
one of the roots. Yeah.
and lest some of our audience thinks to themselves, "Oh, these poor addicts and alcoholics." Those poor people, I'll pray for them. Here's what I say to you. Wake up, is what I say, because all of us have pathological, compulsive, unhealthy relationships with either a person, a behavior, or a substance that has mood-altering effects and negative consequences. Everybody. And it could be with work, it could be with sex, it could be in your relationship with your codependent relationship with your kids, your partner, your friends, whatever that is. These are all strategies. So we have to get out of the mindset that addicts are a unique subset of the population that has a crazy strategy for getting needs met that in a way that is not serving them well. That everybody does this, and that attachment theory is one model, and there's other models. I think internal family systems is super helpful. I think several other models that are great for understanding the journey toward wholeness, right?
Absolutely.
And toward a secure relationship with the divine, which is ultimately, if Carl Jung is right, and I think he is, that is what we were looking for all along.
I completely agree. I think that's so beautifully said. And it reminds me of this song I used to listen to. It's a beautiful song. It's a spiritual song, and it's by a man named, I think his name is Trevor Hall. And he says, "Don't you put your stones in your bowl of light." And the analogy is meant to be that, we come into the world and we're connected to our light, right? Which is our connection to God or to something greater than ourselves. And then our conditioning, right, puts these stones in the bowl and we collect, oh, I'm going to be abandoned. Okay, that becomes the stone that blocks the light from shining through. Oh, my conditioning where I get spoken to negatively. Okay, now I speak negatively to myself. I'm not good enough. I'm unworthy. And we put these stones in the bowl of light. And I not only think that getting into God, into relationship with God is one of the most important things on our healing journey. But I also am a believer that as we naturally recondition these painful ideas, as we challenge and question these things, these old wounds, these old fears, these old triggers, as we actually work on them at a subconscious level, we're removing them from our bowl of light, and it makes it easier to get into access to something greater and bigger than ourselves. And I think it's naturally what sort of is that resting state that we come into the world from to begin with.
So we're coming close to wrap up time. And I want to ask you this question. You are helping thousands of people transform their lives. But what is it right now that you're actively working on in yourself? Like what, either with your therapist or on your spiritual journey, when I say that, what immediately comes to mind? I'm working on X.
I would say that the biggest thing, and this is honestly just the answer, the biggest thing that I am working on is around my health. So I've really learned. I had a lot of mold exposure and a lot of things, and so I've done a lot of mental emotional work. But I'm really working on. I just learned I have all these mycotoxins, so I'm working on, I guess, how it relates to a personal journey is having healthier boundaries to make more space for like, wait, I have to be able to do a proper detox and a healing protocol here and all these different things because, I wake up some days with brain fog or I don't feel 100%. And I just had this kind of background feeling of not feeling so great. And I'm very the type of person who can just keep going, going, going. And I realized like, hold on a second, sort of very on point for the two, I suppose, indirectly. I'm like, I have better boundaries with work over the years, but I'm like, let me just carve out a little more space and time to make this the highest priority, even if that means taking an extra day off here and there during the week or things like that to really make space for that deep inner cleansing.
I'm so glad you said that because it's a good lesson for our Enneagram Twos, but for all of us, right? One of the things that people, and I understand how this happens. However, it's not a good thing. People often, when they think about Enneagram types, they actually, what comes up in their mind is actually a stereotype, which is not a type, right? And so the stereotype of the two sometimes is, the over caring, codependent, mother type who's just, showing up everywhere with a casserole, right? Like just like he keeps 10 frozen casseroles in their car and just dropping them off at people's houses, right? Blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, first of all, that's sexist. And second of all, like there's a lot more to twos than you realize. Number one, some of the most ambitious people I know are twos, not threes. They're twos, especially what we call social twos. And the social two is particularly ambitious. Now, you have a 2 and a 3 wing, which only accelerates the level of ambition and busyness and goal orientation and all that stuff, right? And what's great about what you're saying is that by setting up those boundaries, and though I don't like this phrase because it's a beaten up trope in the culture, and I don't like it, is part of the twos healing journey is always going to involve self-care, because they're always caring for others.
Totally.
And so they then ignore their own health and well-being in service to, you could do this, right? You could say, I'm serving the thousands of people on my platform, right? Blah, 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 blah. And it's like, actually, that's a very unhealthy state. You must have both the boundaries to say, this is as far as my work goes, and this is where I end and my work begins. They're not the same thing. There's no blur between these two realities in my life. And I think that's a big message for twos.
Absolutely. And that's actually something that at the first 2 years of being on our platform and really having it like grow, I almost like lost identification in the difference between myself and my work. Like it was something I realized, oh my gosh, I'm almost so enmeshed with my work now that this is what's going on. And then I did, a good bit of work on that and came out of that. And then I think that next sort of lesson for me was I was working on my health, but in the background, in a way, slowly but surely, and realizing, hold on a second here. If I knew someone who was going through these kinds of little things in the background, I would stop everything to be like, hey, this needs to be sorted out, because there's long-term consequences of not seeing this all the way through and just feeling like, oh, I'm just doing enough to feel pretty good every day or pretty okay. And realizing that, hold on, true self-love means being able to love and give as much to myself as I would to somebody very close to me, and to put that amount of effort in. And that was sort of, that is what has allowed me to sort of reframe the way I'm approaching this more recently.
I love it. Hey, everybody. Remember, you heard it here. Thais Gibson, our new friend. You heard all about the work that she's doing and the book that she's written, Learning to Love, and much, much more. But you can learn more about Thais by going to
personaldevelopmentschool.com. And we also have a YouTube channel, Personal Development School Thais Gibson.
I love it. I'm so honored that you were on the show. What a rich and lovely conversation. And I really appreciated, your vulnerability, but also your willingness to talk about your own journey. And I would also say your enthusiasm. Now, what I love about the word enthusiasm is that it derives from two Greek words, en, meaning in, and theos, which means God.
Oh, wow. That's beautiful.
So a person who is enthusiastic, right, you might say, is in the flow of God. And I love when I can feel your pressured speech when you're talking in a lovely way, not in a manic way, but this kind of like, you're so excited about what you're doing and the work that you're a part of, that you're in a healthy way, a little out over your skis. And I love that energy. And so thanks for bringing it to the show. Anthony,
Thank you so much. I just want to say thank you so much for having me. I love the depth of your questions and just how you sort of touch on all these different layers of everything from Carl Jung to God, to addiction, to attachment, to the Enneagram. And just they're some of my favorite topics. And I loved how insightful and thoughtful some of your questions were. This is one of my favorite conversations I've ever had. So I really appreciate being here.
Thank you. Continue. Go on. Anthony, I love you, my brother.
Love you. Good to be with you both.
And Typology,
Anthony.
Typology Tribe, I love you as well. As you know, may you have love, may you have joy, may you have peace. May you have healing and may you have rest. Until next time.